Lemmy with RevZilla, and today I'm on a 2018 Honda Goldwing tour. I'm down here in the Lone Star State. Honda chose to debut this bike down here. We came down, spent some time with them. I've been riding a few of these bikes, sampling their wares, and I have to say, the 6th generation of the Goldwing really underwent one heck of an overhaul. But in order to best understand the redesign, you really have to understand who it is that Honda is speaking to with this motorcycle. And they say they're after 3 different types of riders, and I tend to agree with them. I see this sort of as a short, medium, and long-term play for them. So let's talk about what I think is their short-term customer, and that's the existing Goldwing rider. I think it's not too much for Honda to assume that people who are currently on a Goldwing and excited about that particular model probably wouldn't have much trouble shelling out for the new 6th gen Goldwing. They were going to want to, take advantage of some of the features and benefits that come along with this redesign. Now, the medium-term customer that I'm thinking of and Honda is shooting for is what they call their returning Goldwing customer. Someone who may have had a Goldwing in the past but wound up on another motorcycle because the Goldwing evolved differently than their needs necessarily required. Now, I think this is going to be a little more elusive customer for Honda to chase down, simply because they're likely to be a little bit more skeptical. These folks are probably going to wait a season or two and see how the early adopters fare before they necessarily jump onto one of these bikes right after they pull their wallet out. Now, the third group of customers, and what I consider kind of the long-term targets, are probably the most important to the continued health of the Goldwing nameplate over time, and that's going to be folks who haven't yet had a touring bike. I don't necessarily mean had a Honda touring bike, but they may not have had a touring bike in general. They may simply not be socially or financially ready for a touring bike at this point in time. Now, these people are going to be important because long model runs are sort of the hallmark of the Goldwing. I mean, heck, this thing went basically since 2001 really unchanged in any major way. So securing these people and making sure that this bike offers what those folks are going to want in 5 to 10 years is actually a pretty important play for Honda. Now, in order to figure out whether or not Honda made the right decisions here in the redesign, we need to get out and actually ride this bike.
Now, I'm not going to sit here and bore you with the entire history behind the Honda Goldwing. It's got a very interesting story, but it's not really relevant to what we're discussing today. However, there is one point in the Goldwing's past I will refer you back to, and that's the moment of its inception. You see, most people have either forgotten or didn't even know in the first place that the Goldwing wasn't always this big monstro, luxo behemoth tourer. Instead, this thing was actually sort of conceived as a GT-style bike. It was meant to be heavy and fast and cover lots of ground. The idea of packing along lots of stuff, of course, and having extreme rider comfort came later. Now, fast forward to the previous generation, the 5th gen Goldwing, and we can really talk about that bike being sort of, the ultimate in terms of opulence. It was unbelievably comfortable for riders, and the carrying capacity on those motorcycles is just staggering. If you can't bring it with you on a Goldwing, well, you really can't bring it with you on almost any two-wheeled conveyance, I would say. Now, of course, we're looking at the 6th generation Goldwing, and this actually sort of pivots and turns and looks back to the bike that gave it its GT roots. This bike underwent a bunch of weight loss. It's 100 pounds lighter. That's nearly transformational on a bike of this size. Now, that didn't come without a couple of strings attached, of course, and I think this might be relatively controversial with fans of the Honda Goldwing. In order to get that 100-pound weight loss, some of the touring capacity went down as well. We lost 37 liters out of the luggage. There's another gallon of gasoline that's gone out of this motorcycle. Still though, 100 pounds is 100 pounds, and this bike behaves entirely differently than its predecessor. Let's get out there on the tarmac. I'm going to show you exactly what this bike can do with 100 fewer pounds.
Now, normally I'd kick off with something about the engine at this part of the review. However, the star of this show is actually the front end. Honda redesigned the front end of this, moving away from a telescopic tubular front end to something totally unconventional from them, and they're calling it their double wishbone. For those of you who are familiar with BMW or other motorcycles, you may know it as a Hasek front end, and for those of you out of the car world, it's very similar to a four-link. Now, the reason this front end is so important is because it allowed Honda really to kind of map out the entire bike a little bit differently. Because a Hasek-style front end kind of removes the braking forces from the suspension forces, when you jam down the front brake, the rest of the bike doesn't slam down trying to kiss the front tire. Because there's now a little bit more room between the rest of the bike and that front tire, it means that Honda was free to move a bunch of things up in the chassis. So the entire drivetrain got moved forward. The rider and passenger, we moved forward as well. I'm actually sitting 36 millimeters forward of where I'd be sitting on a 17 model GL 1800. And I'll be honest, the trick absolutely works. It works fantastically. The steering on this bike is so light. I was making the joke, this feels more like an ST 1800 than a GL 1800. Whether you're putting it down in the corner, holding it in the corner, or pulling it back up, it's almost like an optical illusion. The way this bike handles really does not belie its weight at all. Now, this front end too does have me raising a couple question marks. Now, granted, some of these things are going to be longer term types of scenarios that we're going to have to figure out. The first is you can see my tie rod sort of bouncing away here. They're really nifty. It's kind of like watching an old Springer go up and down. But those tie rods are like an automotive tie rod. They are going to wear over time. That is the rider's link between the handlebars and the front end. So riders are going to have to keep a really careful eye on those to make sure that steering stays tight on these bikes. The other thing comes to mind too is that, well, alignments are probably going to be necessary as well. Just like on a car, setting the toe at minimum is going to have to happen on a motorcycle that is set up this way. But for me, the bigger question mark was Honda's continued use of ball bearings in the steering head. Now, granted, the steering head is taking forces a little bit differently than it would on a conventional telescopic front end. However, if you guys remember back when I reviewed our 15 Goldwing, we had that bike, and I had a wicked case of head shake. The front end on that thing was just kicking around like nobody's business. Now, many riders, myself included, thought that might have had something to do with the head bearings. Some thought it was tires. I think there might have been a little bit of overlap between the two, and I think that the head bearings may have actually helped shorten the tire's life. But regardless, considering how many people went to aftermarket companies like All Balls in order to get tapered bearings for their steering heads on the older GL 1800s, it was really surprising that Honda didn't make that move as well. I think we just need to sort of see how things play out with this front end. Now we can move on to the drivetrain. So the 1800cc mill underneath me is almost completely different. Very little carries over from the previous engine. However, it's very odd. Honda kept all the character with that motor. Despite the fact they made lots of changes, which you can read about in our written article, this thing feels very, very similar. You're looking at about 125 horse, 125 foot-pounds of torque, so output's up just a little bit, but it has all of the same characteristics we loved about the earlier flat six. Honey smooth, gobs and gobs of torque. This is the perfect engine for this motorcycle. The really interesting part, though, is behind the engine. That's in the transmission. Gone is that 5-speed manual. Now we're looking at a 6-speed manual, as well as the option for a 7-speed DCT, which I'm actually on right now. I gotta be honest, I'm totally sold on this DCT. It makes more sense on a touring bike than almost any other motorcycle. It just frees you up to look at the scenery, to see what's going on. It's one less thing that you actually have to take care of and think about, and it allows you really just to watch what's going on in the world around you. It's phenomenal. If you're considering a new Goldwing, even if you think you're a diehard gear clicker, I would say take a ride on the DCT. Is it worth the extra $1,000 Honda wants? Well, that's going to be up to individual buyers to decide. Now, moving on from the transmission, one of the other items got major attention this year is in the brakes. Rear brake rotor size about the same. However, the front brake rotors received an increase in diameter. It means the calipers are able to exert a little more leverage on them. Those calipers are now radially mounted, and as far as I'm concerned, the big news here is those calipers go from a 3-pot caliper to a 6-pot. All of these braking improvements really make the Goldwing probably most improved as far as braking is concerned. The old Goldwing, you really had to plan your stops. I remember being very underwhelmed by the brakes on that. I like the brakes on this bike. They work phenomenally, especially in conjunction with that front end. It's a great setup. The only nit I have to pick is probably Honda's continued use of their combined ABS system, where they combine the brakes. The front brake actuates the rear brake, which doesn't bother me. However, the rear brake pedal also actuates some of the front brake as well. That part I don't really like. It kind of upsets the chassis. It's a little disconcerting for low-speed parking lot work, but I will say with the new front end, it's not quite as bad as it could be. All that having been said, I prefer Honda junked that system. Now, we've talked plenty about the mechanics here. We've kind of raced through them, but what we really need to get into is some of the rider comforts and amenities that come on this bike, and that's a little better done, I think, when the bike's at a stop. So let me find a good spot to pull over here.
Now, when it comes to electronics and rider niceties, Honda gets a gold star. They've included all sorts of details in this bike to really make it stand out. This is now a first-class motorcycle once again. There's all sorts of cool things hidden all over this motorcycle. We finally have an adjustable windshield that's electrically adjustable. No more manual adjustments on this thing. It's nice to see Honda update that. There's also all sorts of other cool things that come standard on this bike. Heated grips and also dual zone heated seats, so both rider and passenger can both be comfortable. Now, it doesn't just stop there too. I think for me, the cherry on top has got to be their infotainment system. It's part and parcel with a touring bike nowadays, and Honda did an excellent job. It's got a 7-inch TFT dash. It's absolutely beautiful. Honda implemented this really, really nicely too. It's intuitive, it's easy to use. In my opinion, this is probably the best infotainment system in the motorcycle industry right now. Now, it's not lost on me, of course, that Honda has made this bike unbelievably comfortable to ride, however, made it a little bit more difficult to spend long hours in the saddle, again, going back to that luggage and fuel capacity reduction here. Having said that, I think I preferred when the Goldwing was sort of the king of the tours. It was absolutely the biggest, it was the best known tourer out there. But I also have a confession too. For my entire riding career, as long as the Goldwing has been around and previously, I never laid down a single cent for one of these. I've never purchased one. Not new and not used. So perhaps that means my opinion is completely irrelevant. Yours, however, is not. If you've got something to say about the new Goldwing or Goldwing Tour, use that comment section. And if you have any more questions about this bike, cruise on over to Comin Tread, where you can check out my first ride review of the Goldwing Tour. Me? Well, I gotta get inside and unpack, and I also gotta suck down a couple of Shiner boxes. I got a long day of riding tomorrow. I'm Lemmy, I'm out of here.